Each mark on my hands tells a story that few would have the courage to hear to the end. But today, I'll tell everything, because silence protects those who hurt, never those who were hurt. Hello, my dears. My name is Cecilia Rodriguez. I'm 88 years old, and I was born in a small town in rural Georgia. If you're seeing this, it's because God has allowed me to live long enough to share a story I've kept buried in my heart for over 70 years. Before I continue, please tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. I like to imagine my words reaching homes across America, as if I could sit in each of your living rooms with a hot cup of coffee to share what I lived through. It was 1953, and America was experiencing the hope of Eisenhower's presidency. But in my small town of Pineville, news traveled slowly, and life continued at the pace of the seasons and harvests. I had just turned 16 when my mother left us. Pneumonia, which today would be treated with antibiotics, was practically a death sentence back then. In less than a week, our home lost the scent of the homemade soap she made and the sound of her fingers strumming the old guitar she had inherited from her father. My father worked on the railroad that crossed the state. He was a good man, but too quiet. One of those who doesn't know how to express pain. He started spending more time away from home after Mom passed. It was as if the walls of our wooden house echoed memories he couldn't face. And so the responsibility of caring for my little brother Peter, who was only 7, fell entirely on my young shoulders. "Cecilia, why doesn't Mom ever come back?" Peter would ask me almost every night, with those little brown eyes brimming with tears he tried to hide. "Because she became a star, my dear. One of those that shine the brightest," was all I could say while I brushed his curly hair before bed, just as our mother used to do. In those first months, we managed as best we could. I took in washing, made sweets to sell at the Sunday market, and traded the eggs from our chickens for other supplies with the neighbors. At night, when Peter was asleep, I would cry quietly with my face buried in the pillow that still held Mom's scent. I was just a girl trying not to be swallowed up by adult responsibilities. It was on a muggy October afternoon that everything changed. The train whistled earlier than usual, announcing my father's arrival. Through the window, I saw that he wasn't alone. A medium-height woman with carefully arranged brown hair and a floral dress, too colorful for our simple little town, walked beside him. Her red lipstick highlighted her broad smile even more. "Cecilia, Peter, come meet Gertrude. She's going to be your new mother," my father announced. Just like that, without preparation, without any prior conversation, he introduced the woman who would change our lives forever. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, merely nodding my head. Peter, hidden behind my skirts, observed the stranger who would now be part of our family. Gertrude approached, her strong jasmine perfume invading our space, and stroked my hair. "Finally, I'll have the daughter I've always dreamed of," she said. Her words sounded sweet, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match. Something I only realized much later, when it was already too late. The first weeks were like a dream after months of nightmare. The house got new curtains, the smell of hot food once again filled the rooms, and even fresh flowers adorned the dining room table on Sundays. Gertrude seemed determined to win over my father, me, and especially Peter, who quickly became enchanted with the incredible stories she told before bedtime. Perhaps, I thought, as I watched her make the cornbread that Peter loved so much, perhaps we can be happy again. And for a brief moment, I sincerely believed that God had sent an angel to heal our wounds. If you're enjoying this story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It nourishes this old woman to know that her memories can touch hearts out there and maybe help someone going through something similar today. My father was smiling again. Gradually, he returned to playing his accordion on Saturday nights, something he hadn't done since before Mom's illness. People in town commented on how rejuvenated he seemed and how lucky we were to have Gertrude in our lives. "A saint," they said at Sunday church. But there were moments, brief instances, when I caught expressions on her face that caused me inexplicable discomfort. Like when Peter accidentally knocked over an antique teacup, a gift she said she had received from her grandmother. For a second, her face transformed into a mask of fury before quickly recomposing itself into a forced smile. "It's okay, my angel. Accidents happen," she said. But her eyes told a different story. One afternoon, about 3 months after her arrival, I was helping arrange her things in the bedroom. My father had insisted she use Mom's sewing room to store her personal belongings. While organizing a drawer of scarves and gloves, I found an old photograph hidden among the fabrics. It was Gertrude, much younger, next to a man who wasn't my father. The two were embracing a girl approximately Peter's age. Intrigued, I turned the photo over and read the inscription: Frank, Gertrude, and Clara, 1947. Confused, I innocently asked, "Who are these people in the photo, Mrs. Gertrude?" It was as if a switch had been flipped. She snatched the photograph from my hands with such force that it left a cut on my index finger. "Never, ever touch my things without permission," she hissed. Her usually calm, calculated eyes now burned with a rage that made me step back. "This is none of your business, understand? None of your business." Frightened, I simply nodded and left the room, my heart racing. That was the first time I saw what was hidden behind the carefully constructed facade. A glimpse of the real Gertrude that I would soon come to know better than I would have liked. That night, seated at the table for dinner, my father announced that he would need to make a work trip. The railroad was being expanded northward, and he would be gone for 2 weeks, longer than he had ever been away since. He didn't complete the sentence, but we all knew, since Mom died. "Don't worry, dear," Gertrude said, placing her hand on his. "I'll take very good care of the children." There was a strange gleam in her eyes, something that made my stomach turn. It was the first time we would be alone with her for so long. If I had known what was coming, I would have begged to go with him. I would have clung to his leg as Peter did when he was younger and afraid of the dark. I would have done anything not to remain under the same roof as Gertrude for those 2 weeks that would mark our lives forever. But I didn't know. I was just a 16-year-old girl, too naive to notice the signs, too inexperienced to recognize the approaching danger. The train departed the next morning, taking my father and our last barrier of protection. I remember standing on the platform, waving until the last car disappeared around the bend, a feeling of emptiness settling in my chest. Peter held my hand tightly, as if sensing that something was wrong. When we turned to go back to the house, Gertrude was no longer smiling. Her face had hardened, and her eyes, always warm in my father's presence, now looked like 2 shards of ice. "Let's go," she said curtly. "We have a lot to do." And so began the most difficult period of our lives, when we discovered that the wolf doesn't always need to hide in sheep's clothing. Sometimes it simply waits for the shepherd to move away from the flock. The moment the door closed behind us, it was as if another woman had emerged in place of the one my father had left to care for us. Gertrude yanked the scarf from her neck, threw her high-heeled shoes in a corner, and unbuttoned the first button of her dress, sighing like someone finally rid of a heavy disguise. "Very well, now for the real rules of this house," she announced, walking to the china cabinet where Dad kept the only bottle of liquor we owned, reserved for important visitors. She served herself generously and downed the glass in one go. "First, no more Mrs. Gertrude. I'm ma'am to both of you, understood? And second, enough of this whimpering about your dead mother." Peter shrank at my side, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Instinctively, I put my arm around him as if I could protect him from the venom dripping from her words. "And as for you," she pointed at me, her eyes narrowing, "you can stop acting like you're the lady of the house. You're not anymore. I am. And there's a lot of work that's been neglected." That same day, I received a list of chores so extensive it would have been impossible for anyone to complete in 24 hours. Wash all the household laundry in the tub with cold water, including the sheets, clean every crevice of the floorboards with a small brush, polish the few silver utensils we had inherited from my grandmother, prepare all 3 meals while she rested, and still tend to the garden behind the house. "And Peter, what will he do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Gertrude smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Peter will have his own duties. Don't worry." The next morning, I discovered what she meant. While I was on my knees scrubbing the living room floor, I saw through the window Peter carrying buckets of water from the well, which was almost half a mile from the house. The buckets were almost his size, and the water spilled over and soaked his short pants. His thin legs trembled with the effort, but each time he stopped to rest, Gertrude clapped her hands from the porch. "Faster, boy! The cistern won't fill itself!" I ran outside, my hands still wet from my work. He's too small to carry that much weight. He'll hurt his back." The slap came so quickly I had no time to dodge it. The palm of her hand left a burning mark on my cheek. "Get back inside and finish your work. Or would you prefer I tell your father how rebellious you've been when he called me last night?" It was the first lie of many. My father had no way of calling. The nearest town with a telephone was miles away. But at that moment, the possibility that he might discover we were causing problems for his new wife terrified me. He was finally happy again. How could we ruin that? And so the days dragged on. From morning until night, we worked under Gertrude's watchful eye. While I washed, cooked, and cleaned, Peter was sent on increasingly difficult tasks, chopping wood with an axe that weighed more than his arms, cleaning the chicken coop, and breathing that dust that made his eyes water for hours, climbing the tallest tree in the yard to pick the ripest fruits. "He's going to fall and hurt himself," I begged one afternoon, seeing my brother precariously balanced on a thin branch of a persimmon tree. "Then perhaps he'll learn to be more careful," she replied, without taking her eyes off the magazine she was leafing through, comfortably seated in the rocking chair that had been my mother's. Meals became another torment. Gertrude ate first, alone, the best part of everything I prepared. Afterward, Peter and I could serve ourselves what was left, which was never enough for two growing children. More than once, I divided my portion with Peter when I saw him staring hungrily at his nearly empty plate. At night, when we finally retired exhausted, Peter began to appear in my room, shivering with cold or fear, sometimes both. "Can I sleep here, Cece?" he would whisper, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "There are strange noises in my room." I knew it wasn't the noises that frightened him, but the certainty that at dawn, another round of humiliations and forced labor would begin. In the comfort of my narrow bed, I would hold him and softly hum the songs our mother used to sing, like "Oh, Susanna" and "Amazing Grace," until his breathing became regular, overcome by exhaustion. My friends from across America, if you're following this story from a comfortable armchair or while doing another activity, I want you to know that every word I share here is like a stone I've carried for decades that I can finally put down. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to protect someone you loved, even when you yourself needed protection. It would give me strength to continue. On the 5th day of that nightmare, Gertrude announced that she needed to go to the neighboring town to visit a cousin and would be away all afternoon. It was the first breath of air we'd had. As soon as the sound of the truck that gave rides to local residents disappeared down the dirt road, I took Peter by the hand and led him to the small creek that cut through the neighboring property. "Come on, today we can play a little," I said, trying to bring back the smile that had been fading from his face. We wet our feet in the cool water, skipped stones to see who could make them bounce more times on the surface, and even tried fishing with an improvised rod. For a few hours, we were just children again, as we should be. Peter laughed genuinely for the first time in days when a very clever little fish stole the bait without being caught. "I think he's smarter than us," he remarked, and his crystal-clear laughter was the most beautiful sound I could hear. But our little escape came at a high price. We lost track of time, and when we realized the sun was already low on the horizon, we ran back to the house only to find Gertrude already waiting for us on the porch, arms crossed and her face contorted into an expression I had learned to fear. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "We finished all the chores," I began to explain, but she raised her hand, silencing me. "I didn't ask what you did. I asked where you were." Peter, trembling beside me, held my hand tightly. "We went to the creek, ma'am," he answered, almost in a whisper. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting. Gertrude stared at us for a long time, like a snake observing its prey before striking. Finally, with studied calm, she pointed inside the house. "Cecilia, go prepare dinner. Peter, come with me to the shed. We need to talk about obedience." Something inside me went on alert. "Can I come too?" I asked quickly, feeling Peter squeeze my hand harder. "No, this is a matter between me and your brother. Go do as I told you." Reluctantly, I let go of Peter's hand. His eyes begged me not to leave him, but what more could I do? If we disobeyed again, we would only make the situation worse. At least, that's what I naively thought at the time. I went to the kitchen, my heart racing. Through the window, I saw the two of them walking to the small tool shed that stood a few yards from the main house. The door closed behind them, and I felt my stomach turn with anxiety. I tried to concentrate on lighting the wood stove and beginning to prepare a soup with the few vegetables we still had in the pantry. But my ears were alert to any sound from outside. For more than half an hour, nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirping of a cardinal that had made its nest under the eaves of the house. When the shed door finally opened, Peter came out first, walking strangely stiff. Even from a distance, I noticed how he kept his arms extended at his sides, avoiding letting them touch anything. Gertrude came right behind him, carrying something she quickly tucked into her apron pocket as soon as she realized I was watching. During dinner, Peter barely touched his food. He sat on the edge of his chair and shuddered every time Gertrude made any sudden movement. When I tried to meet his gaze, he looked away, staring obstinately at his plate as if all the answers to our problems were there. Later, when everyone had retired, Peter didn't come to my room as usual. Worried, I waited until Gertrude turned off the light in her room and went to the small room at the end of the hallway where my brother slept. I knocked softly, but there was no response. I opened the door anyway. Peter was lying face down on the bed, still dressed. When I approached and touched his shoulder, he stifled a groan of pain. This next part is perhaps the most painful to share. If you're finding any value in my story, please take a moment to subscribe to Grandparents' Tales and give this video a like. Knowing these memories might help someone else is what gives me the courage to continue. "What did she do to you?" I whispered, fear and anger mixing in my voice. Slowly, with careful movements, Peter lifted his shirt. Even in the dim light, illuminated only by the moon coming through the small window, I could see the red marks that crossed his back in parallel lines, switch marks, old enough not to bleed anymore, recent enough to swell the fragile skin. Something inside me broke at that moment. A rage I didn't know existed erupted with such force that I had to bite my lip until I tasted the metallic flavor of blood to keep from screaming. It was 1953 in rural Georgia, where children regularly received educational spankings, but this was different. This was deliberate cruelty, pleasure in causing pain. "She said it's our secret," Peter murmured through silent tears. "She said if I told anyone, especially you or Daddy, she'd send me to a boarding school where they hit much harder." Hugging my brother with all the care not to press on his wounds, I made a silent promise. Gertrude would never touch him again. I would find a way to protect him, even if it meant facing the demon in a floral dress who had invaded our lives. The next morning, I began to develop what I called the protection system, a silent plan that, I didn't know then, would end up saving us in ways I could never have imagined. That morning, I woke up even before the first crow of the rooster with a clarity I had never felt before. As I watched the still dark sky through the window, I knew I needed to act. I was no longer a frightened girl. I was the only protection my brother had in this world. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I mentally traced my plan. I needed to be smart, more astute than Gertrude. Confronting her directly would only make the situation worse, especially for Peter. The clock on the wall read 4:30 a.m. I still had at least an hour before Gertrude woke up. Silently, I walked down the wooden hallway, avoiding the boards that creaked, to Peter's room. He slept restlessly, his breathing still ragged from the pain. I sat beside him and lightly touched his shoulder. "Peter," I whispered, "we need to talk before she wakes up." His eyes opened instantly, that alert look of someone who has learned to sleep with one ear attentive to danger. I helped him sit up carefully. "I'm going to protect you, but we need to be clever," I explained in a low voice. "I've created a system for us. First, always stay where I can see you. If you can't see me, stay where you can hear me." I explained our new code. One short whistle would mean, "Careful, she's coming." 2 quick whistles would mean, "Hide." And 1 long whistle would indicate, "All clear, you can come back." We practiced a few times until he could reproduce the sounds correctly. "And most importantly," I continued, "never be alone with her. If she tells you to go somewhere, say you need to use the bathroom first and come tell me." Peter nodded, his eyes revealing a mixture of fear and trust. That look from someone so small, placing all his hope in me, strengthened my determination even more. I'm going to wake up earlier every day, I promised, and do all the heavy chores before she can make you do them. That same morning, when the first rays of the sun had barely appeared, I had already filled half the cistern with water from the well, fed the chickens, and started preparing coffee. When Gertrude appeared in the kitchen, rubbing her eyes swollen from sleep and probably from the liquor she had drunk the night before, she seemed genuinely surprised. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, looking suspiciously at the table set with fresh coffee. "I thought you might like to start the day with everything in order, ma'am," I replied, keeping my eyes lowered to hide any trace of defiance. She studied me for a moment, as if trying to decipher if there was any trap in my actions. Finally, she shrugged and sat down to eat. "Where's your brother?" "He already fed the chickens and is cleaning the pig pen," I lied naturally, knowing that Peter was actually hidden in the attic, eating the bread with jelly that I had set aside for him earlier. Gertrude smiled that cold smile that never reached her eyes. "I see you've finally understood how things work around here." I quickly learned that prevention was better than cure. I spent nights planning every detail of the next day, which tasks I could complete before dawn, how to distract Gertrude at critical moments, where to hide small portions of food for Peter and for myself as well. I also began to map her moods. There were patterns. On mornings when she woke up with a puffy face and red eyes, her temper was particularly explosive. On those days, I created small distractions, accidentally spilling a little flour on the floor to clean up while Peter sneaked out to the yard, or mentioning I had seen a rat in the pantry, knowing her fear of rodents would keep her away for hours. For children of the 2000s who are listening to me now, it might seem strange that we couldn't simply call someone or ask for help. But in 1953 in rural Georgia, a child would never question the authority of an adult, especially the father's wife. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and even then, family problems were private matters where no one dared to interfere. If you're watching from somewhere in America, leave in the comments what your strategy would be in this situation. It moves me to know that decades later, I can share this story and perhaps help someone who is experiencing something similar. One of the most important parts of my system was ensuring that Peter always had the strength to defend himself if needed. Since Gertrude strictly controlled our food, I secretly began to cultivate a small vegetable patch behind the woodshed, in a spot where the shade of the trees hid it from view of the house. I also befriended the washerwoman's daughter who passed in front of our house on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In exchange for small favors like sewing a button or fixing her doll's dress, she would occasionally bring me eggs or a piece of cheese she managed to take from her employer's kitchen without anyone noticing. Another crucial aspect was preventing Gertrude from discovering our plans. I learned to read her expressions, to anticipate her movements. When she furrowed her brow in a specific way and started tapping her nails on the table, it was a sign she was about to create some pretext to punish Peter. In those moments, I would purposely drop something or ask a question about her past. I discovered she liked to talk about her supposed glamorous life in the city before marrying my father. The nights became our refuge. After Gertrude fell asleep, usually after several doses of the liquor my father kept for special occasions, Peter would come to my room. There, by the light of a candle I kept hidden under the bed, we continued his studies. He had stopped going to school since Mom died because there was no one to take him to town, and now Gertrude insisted that work teaches more than books. "But the teacher said I'm good with numbers," Peter lamented as we practiced multiplication tables in hushed voices. "And you are," I confirmed. "One day you'll go back to school and be the best student in the class." I used Mom's old recipe notebook to teach him to read better. Each ingredient, each instruction became a lesson in English. For math, we used the beans I hid in my pockets during sorting before cooking. Science, we learned by observing the plants growing in our secret garden. And history, I told through the stories Mom had taught me. But not every day could we completely avoid Gertrude's fury. On a particularly hot afternoon, when the air seemed too heavy to breathe, she discovered that I had saved a piece of cake from breakfast to give to Peter later. "So this is how you thank me?" she shouted, her face contorted with rage. "Stealing food!" "It's not stealing," I argued, trying to stay calm. "I just saved some for later when he gets hungry after working in the sun." The slap I received was so hard that I staggered backward, nearly falling. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my tooth had cut the inside of my cheek. "You think you're so clever," she hissed, bringing her face close to mine. "You think I don't see what you're doing, trying to make me look like the villain so your father will abandon me like all the others." That others echoed in my mind. Who were these others? The man in the photograph? The girl who looked like Peter? "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, keeping a respectful tone despite the anger boiling inside me. "I know very well that you write letters to your father behind my back," she accused, though this was a complete fabrication. "I know you tell lies about me." At that moment, Peter came running into the kitchen, his eyes wide with fear at the scene. "We haven't done anything like that," he protested, his voice faltering. It was the first time I saw him directly confront Gertrude. To my surprise, she backed down. Something in Peter's determined look, so similar to our father's, seemed to momentarily disarm her. With one last furious glance, she stormed out, slamming the door, muttering that she needed to get some fresh air before she did something crazy. When she had gone, I hugged Peter tightly. "Why does she hate us so much?" he asked with the painful innocence of a child trying to understand adult cruelty. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I think it's not about us. There's something in her past, something that hurt her deeply." That night, while applying a cloth soaked in cold water to my swollen cheek, I made a discovery that would completely change our strategy. Gertrude had forgotten her diary under the cushion of the rocking chair on the porch. Normally, I would never invade someone's privacy like this, but our safety was at stake. With trembling hands, I opened the brown-covered notebook and began to read. The first pages were full of mundane observations about life in the city before meeting my father. But then I found mentions of Frank and my little Clara. As I read on, a heartbreaking story was revealed. Her first husband had abandoned her, taking their daughter, the girl in the photograph. And from what I understood reading between the lines, he left her after discovering she had episodes, periods of intense anger followed by deep melancholy. Gertrude had tried several times to regain custody of her daughter without success. The last entry about Clara said that she and her father had moved to New York City, and that Gertrude hadn't been able to find them the 2 times she had saved enough money to travel there. I closed the diary and returned it exactly where I had found it, with a heavy heart. Now I understood better the monster living with us. She was no less frightening, but at least she had a more human face. The pain of losing a daughter had transformed her into someone capable of inflicting pain on other children. This discovery didn't justify her actions, but it gave me a new tool for our protection system: knowledge. The next morning, I discreetly placed a flower on the breakfast table, a small wild daisy. When Gertrude questioned it, I replied simply, "Mom used to say a flower brightens any room. I thought it might bring good memories." I saw something change in her eyes for a brief instant, a flash of humanity that rarely appeared. She didn't thank me, but she didn't throw the flower away either, placing it in a glass with water. From that day on, I included in our system small gestures calculated to appeal to whatever humanity remained in her. Not out of compassion, but out of strategy. I would casually mention how nice it would be if someday Peter had an older sister to look up to, knowing this would touch the open wound of her lost daughter. Or I would ask if she could teach me to make the special cornbread she had mentioned once when she was in a good mood. These small acts didn't transform Gertrude into a loving person, but they created small moments of truce that we used to breathe, to gather strength. It was like dancing with a snake, dangerous, exhausting, but necessary to survive. For almost a week, our system worked reasonably well. I woke up before dawn, completed the heaviest tasks, protected Peter, and tried to keep Gertrude distracted or satisfied enough not to take out her frustrations on us. But then, on the eve of my father's return, everything changed. The plan I had so carefully constructed crumbled in a single rainy night. The night that would come to be known between us simply as the night of the fever. The storm began late in the afternoon, one of those that transform the sky into lead and make the trees dance violently. Lightning cut across the horizon at increasingly shorter intervals, and the rumble of thunder made the windows of our house tremble in their frames. "It's going to be a difficult night," Gertrude commented, observing through the window the dark clouds gathering. "Your father should arrive tomorrow if the train can get through with all this rain." I felt a pang of hope. Just one more night, and Dad would be back. One more night, and we could, at least temporarily, breathe a little easier under the protection of his presence. Dinner passed in silence, interrupted only by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional roar of thunder. Peter barely touched his food, pushing the beans and rice around on his plate without enthusiasm. I noticed his face was flushed, more than normal, but I attributed it to the muggy heat that preceded the storm. "May I be excused, ma'am?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Gertrude studied him for a moment, as if looking for some reason to deny the request, but ended up nodding. "Go, and don't forget to leave dry firewood set aside for tomorrow morning." Peter dragged himself out of the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in a way that squeezed my heart. I finished washing the dishes quickly, anxious to check on him. When I was finally able to go to his room, the rain was already falling in dense curtains, pounding the roof forcefully. I knocked lightly on the door. No response. I entered slowly and found him already in bed, wrapped in blankets despite the heat. "Peter," I called softly, approaching. When I touched his forehead, I recoiled in alarm. He was burning with fever. "I feel strange, Cece," he murmured, his glazed eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Everything hurts." I sat on the edge of the bed and brushed the damp hair from his forehead, my heart racing in panic as I realized how hot he was. In 1953, in rural Georgia, high fever was not something to be treated lightly. Without readily available antibiotics, without a nearby hospital, a simple flu could turn into pneumonia in a matter of days. As many of you watching know, especially the older folks, in those days we relied on home remedies, those passed down from mother to daughter. Tell me in the comments if your family also had these old recipes for bringing down fever, because I used one that night that I learned from my mother. "I'm going to get something to help you." "Don't worry," I whispered, and silently left the room, taking care not to alert Gertrude. In the kitchen, I prepared a tea of orange leaves with honey, one of the remedies Mom always used when we had fevers. I also grabbed a bucket of cold water and clean cloths for compresses. As I passed through the living room, I saw Gertrude asleep in the armchair, an empty glass of liquor on the small table beside her. At least that played in our favor. I returned to Peter's room and began administering care. Cold compresses on his forehead and armpits to lower the temperature, warm tea to hydrate. For almost an hour, it seemed to be working. His skin cooled a bit, and he even managed to doze briefly. But around 10 p.m., the fever returned with redoubled force. Peter began to delirious, speaking disconnected phrases, calling for our mother. His lips were dry and cracked, and his breathing, previously regular, now came in gasps. I understood with growing terror that home remedies would not be enough. We needed professional help. The only doctor in the area lived in town, 12 miles away. With the storm and darkness, it would be impossible to get there on foot, and we didn't have a horse or any other means of transportation. There was only one option. Gertrude needed to know. With a heavy heart, I returned to the living room where she still slept, the expression on her face surprisingly peaceful in sleep, almost maternal, a cruel irony considering her waking vigilance. "Ma'am," I called, lightly touching her shoulder. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you." She woke with a start, her eyes unfocused for a moment, before fixing on me with their usual coldness. "What do you want at this hour?" "It's Peter. He's very sick with a high fever. We need a doctor." Gertrude adjusted herself in the armchair, sighing impatiently. "It's just a childish fever. Give him some tea and he'll be fine in the morning." "I've already tried that. The fever keeps rising and he's delirious. Please, we need to get help." Something in my voice must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because she stood up and followed me to Peter's room. Seeing the state of him, his red and contorted face, his small body trembling under the covers despite the heat, his half-open and unfocused eyes, her expression changed. "How long has he been like this?" she demanded. "The fever started this afternoon, but it's gotten much worse in the last hour," I explained, anxiously wringing my hands. Gertrude placed her hand on his forehead and frowned. For the first time since she had entered our lives, I saw something almost like genuine concern on her face. "Your father would kill me if something happened to the boy," she muttered, more to herself than to me. Then, straightening her shoulders, "It's impossible to get the doctor with this storm. We'll have to care for him until dawn." It was at that moment that Peter had a seizure. His small body arched on the bed, his eyes rolled back, and a sharp moan escaped his lips. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. "Good God!" exclaimed Gertrude, stepping back. "Do something!" I shouted, forgetting all the caution and forced submission of recent days. He could die. In that critical moment, something unexpected happened. Gertrude seemed to transform before my eyes. The mask of indifference fell away, replaced by an expression of almost professional determination. "Take off his covers. We need to bring down that fever immediately," she ordered, rolling up her sleeves. "Bring more cold water, clean towels, and if you have it, the bottle of alcohol from the pantry." I ran to fetch what she had asked for, dazed by the sudden change. When I returned, Gertrude had already removed Peter's sweat-soaked shirt and kept him only in shorts, applying cold compresses to specific points on his body: neck, armpits, groin. "My mother was a midwife," she explained without my asking, as she mixed alcohol with water in a basin. "I saw many children with high fevers. We need to prevent another seizure at all costs." For the next few hours, we worked side by side in tense silence, changing the compresses every few minutes. Gertrude demonstrated surprising knowledge about home medical care. She prepared an infusion of herbs she kept at the bottom of her suitcase, something she said she had learned from a Native American healer years before. "Open his mouth gently," she instructed, holding a spoon with the dark liquid. "It's bitter, but it will help." The storm continued outside, as if the sky itself were at war. But inside that small room, a silent truce had been established. I saw Gertrude massage Peter's legs when he had cramps and whisper words of comfort in his ear when he called for our mother. "Clara used to get fevers like this," she said suddenly, around 3 a.m. when the rain finally began to lessen. "My daughter, she almost died on a night like this." I didn't respond, afraid of breaking the fragile moment of vulnerability. I don't know how to be a mother anymore," she confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. When Frank took Clara away, something inside me died. The moon managed to pierce the clouds at that moment, casting a weak silvery light through the window, partially illuminating Gertrude's face. I saw silent tears running down her cheeks and understood that I was seeing the real woman behind the mask of cruelty, a woman broken by losses and disappointments who had channeled all her pain into hatred. Around 5 a.m., Peter's fever finally began to subside. His breathing became more regular, and his skin, previously scalding, was now just warm to the touch. Color gradually returned to his face, replacing the intense red of the fever. "He'll be all right," declared Gertrude, rising with visible effort after hours kneeling beside the bed. "The crisis has passed." I realized then that we had spent the entire night together, united by the common goal of saving Peter's life. But what did this mean for us? For our future in this house? Something had changed, but I didn't know exactly what. As the first rays of the sun began to illuminate the room, we heard the distant sound of a train whistle. Dad would be arriving soon, without even imagining the drama we had lived through in his absence. Gertrude paused at the door, looking at Peter, who now slept peacefully, exhausted from the battle his small body had fought. "Go get some rest," she told me in a tone I didn't immediately recognize until I realized it was gentleness. "I'll prepare breakfast for when your father arrives." When she left, I sat on the edge of Peter's bed, running my fingers gently through his damp hair. He opened his eyes slightly, lucidity returning to his gaze. "I dreamed of Mom," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "She said everything would be all right." I swallowed the lump that formed in my throat. "And it will be, Peter. I promise you." We didn't know then, but that stormy night, the night of the fever, had been a turning point. The scars Gertrude had inflicted on us wouldn't miraculously disappear, nor would her behavior change overnight. Some wounds are too deep to be completely healed, but something fundamental had changed. For one night, we saw the humanity behind the monster, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had glimpsed in us not rivals or obstacles, but children who, like her own lost daughter, only yearned for protection and love. Watching the sunrise through the window, with its promising hues tinting the sky after the storm, something within me strengthened. The coming weeks, months, and even years would not be easy, But that night I learned that even in the darkest circumstances, small lights can emerge in the most unexpected places. And when the train whistle sounded again, closer now, announcing my father's return, I understood that our story was far from over. The scars we carried would slowly begin to transform into a purpose that would accompany me for the next 70 years and brings me to you today, sharing these memories. Before we go to the last chapter of this story, I want to thank each of you who is following along. It is a privilege at 88 years old to be able to transform my pain into something that might help someone out there. Please share this video with someone you believe needs to hear this message of hope in the midst of darkness. Also, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me a lot. The train arrived punctually at 7 a.m. From the porch, I saw Dad get off with his worn leather suitcase, his face lighting up at the sight of our house. That genuine smile, so rare since Mom's departure, brought tears to my eyes. He had no idea what we had lived through during his 2-week absence. Gertrude went to meet him at the station, her floral dress impeccable, her hair carefully arranged, as if the woman who had spent all night caring for a feverish boy had never existed. From a distance, I observed the hug they exchanged, the affectionate kiss, the way she took his suitcase with a gesture of dedication. "Where are the children?" I heard my father ask as they approached the house. "Peter is resting. He had a little fever during the night, but he's much better now," Gertrude replied, her voice melodious and concerned. "Cecilia is with him now." There was no lie in these words, only the omission of everything that had happened before, the punishments, the humiliations, the forced labor. For a moment, I considered running to my father and telling him everything, opening the floodgates of that dam of secrets we had built. But then I remembered his illuminated face, how he seemed to have finally found some peace after months of desperate mourning. When he entered the room where Peter slept, my father knelt beside the bed, his concerned eyes examining every inch of my brother's face. "How is he really?" he asked in a low voice. "It was a difficult night," I answered honestly. "The fever got very high. He even had a seizure." My father turned pale. "Why didn't you go get Dr. Mendez?" "The storm was too strong. The roads must be impassable," explained Gertrude, who had entered the room silently. "But we took care of him all night." She paused, then added, "Cecilia was tireless." I looked at her, surprised by the unexpected praise. Our gazes met for a second, and something unspoken passed between us. A mutual recognition, perhaps, that we had both changed during that night. The days that followed brought a strange normalcy to our house. Gertrude remained controlling and sometimes harsh, but the physical punishments ceased completely. Peter returned to school in town, as my father had insisted before traveling, and I gained permission to help at Mr. Joaquin's grocery store 3 times a week, which gave me not only some pocket money, but also a respite from the tense atmosphere at home. It was at the grocery store on a muggy March afternoon in 1954, almost 6 months after the night of the fever, that I encountered Sophie, the parish priest's eldest daughter, recently returned from the seminary in Atlanta, where she was studying to be a teacher. "Cecilia Rodriguez, don't tell me it's you. How you've grown, girl," Sophie exclaimed upon recognizing me, embracing me with genuine joy. Sophie was 7 years older than me, but we had been neighbors when we were little, before her family moved to the parsonage in the center of town. We talked for almost an hour while she waited for Mr. Joaquin to separate the orders for the church festival. "And how is your life since your stepmother arrived?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Dad mentioned that your father seems very happy with the new marriage." I hesitated, unsure about how much to reveal. Sophie noticed my reluctance and gently squeezed my hand. "The walls of country houses have ears, but words spoken inside the church are protected by confidentiality," she said with an understanding smile. "If you need to talk, I'll be in the sacristy tomorrow after the 6 o'clock Mass." That conversation in the sacristy, in the shadow of the altar covered with lace cloths made by the community ladies, changed my life forever. Sophie listened in silence as I poured out for the first time all the horror of those 2 weeks, the impossible tasks, Peter's punishments, the constant fear, the protection system I had to develop. But I also spoke about the night of the fever, about glimpsing the broken human being behind the mask of cruelty. "Cecilia," Sophie said when I finished, "what you did to protect your brother was extraordinary. Few people would have that strength. I shook my head, feeling I didn't deserve the compliment. What should I do now? Tell my father? He's so happy. Sophie reflected for a moment. You have to trust your intuition, but remember that painful secrets rarely remain buried forever. Sooner or later, they find a way to surface. She was right, of course, but the way the truth finally emerged was nothing I could have imagined. 3 weeks after that conversation, when I was returning from the grocery store, I found Gertrude in the yard, kneeling before the small garden I had secretly cultivated behind the shed. My heart raced. The garden was my food reserve for Peter, a vital part of our protection system, even though its necessity had diminished in recent months. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying not to sound accusatory. Gertrude rose slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands on her apron. "These lettuce seedlings are poorly positioned. They get too much sun in this corner." It wasn't the answer I expected. "You knew about the garden?" She gave a half smile, almost sad. "I know many things, Cecilia. I always have." We stood there, the gentle breeze swaying the tender leaves of the garden, the afternoon sun casting our shadows on the moist earth. There was something different about Gertrude that day, a fragility I had never noticed before. "I received a letter today," she said. "Finally, from Frank, my ex-husband." My stomach froze. So much time had passed since I had found the hidden photograph, since I had secretly read her diary, that I had almost forgotten about that other life she had had. "Clara died 3 months ago. Meningitis." Her voice was monotone, as if reciting facts about a stranger. She was almost Peter's age. "I'm sorry," I murmured, and was surprised to realize I was sincere. Gertrude nodded briefly before turning her back and walking toward the house. She stopped after a few steps, and without turning around, said, "Radishes would grow well there next to the carrots. The soil is good." It was the closest thing to a peace offering we received. In the months that followed, a tense coexistence was established in our house. Gertrude never transformed into the loving stepmother of fairy tales, but the abuses ceased completely. In her most vulnerable moments, usually at night after a glass of liquor, she would talk about Clara, sharing stories of her daughter that seemed like an effort to keep her alive through words. And I listened, not out of compassion at first, but because each story gave me more tools to understand the woman who had entered our lives like a hurricane. With time, something close to understanding developed between us. Never friendship or affection, but a mutual respect born from the recognition that we both carried deep pain. In 1956, when I turned 19, Sophie returned permanently to our town to take over the primary school. With her encouragement, I took the exam for the normal school and was accepted. Gertrude, surprisingly, did not object when I announced I would move to the city to study. "You have a sharp mind," was all she said. "It would be a waste not to use it." The years passed. I graduated as a teacher in 1960 and returned to my town, taking over the literacy class. Peter, now a young man of 14, had become an exemplary student, dreaming of studying medicine, a dream he would eventually fulfill, graduating as a pediatrician in 1972 from Emory University. Dad and Gertrude remained married until 1968, when he died of a sudden heart attack. On the night of the wake, when everyone had already retired, I found Gertrude sitting alone on the porch, looking at the stars with an expression of absolute loneliness. "What will happen now?" I asked, without really expecting an answer. "I'll go back to Boston," she said. "I have a sister there." I nodded, imagining that would be the end of our strange and painful connection. But before leaving, Gertrude handed me a package wrapped in brown paper. "So, you never forget," she said enigmatically. I opened the package weeks later when I finally had the courage and found her diary filled with new entries I hadn't read before. In the last pages, I found a confession that left me breathless. "When Joseph brought me to this house, I saw in Peter the son I never had, and in Cecilia the rival who could divert my new husband's affection. I transformed my pain into poison and almost destroyed 2 innocent children. I don't deserve forgiveness, but perhaps one day they will understand that the monster they saw wasn't me. It was the pain wearing my skin." Those words haunted me for years. They didn't provide justification for her actions, but they offered a perspective that I, in my wounded youth, couldn't fully see. In 1975, at 38, already married and with 2 children of my own, I received news that Gertrude had died in a nursing home in Boston. I felt a complex emotion that I couldn't name. Not sadness, not relief, perhaps just the closing of a painful chapter that had shaped who I had become. It was that same year that I founded the first shelter for abused children in our region. I used the money from the sale of my parents' house and the tireless support of Sophie, who by then was directing the state school. Peter, now an established doctor in the capital, returned monthly to provide free care for our children. "Why did you choose this work, Mrs. Cecilia?" A young reporter from the local newspaper asked me at the inauguration. "What motivated you?" I looked at the scars on my hands, marks left by years of heavy work in childhood, and smiled. Because I learned that the worst scars are those that no one can see. And I also learned that even the most broken people can be mended with patience and understanding. Over the years, dozens of children passed through our shelter. Some came from homes destroyed by alcoholism, others from situations of neglect or abuse. For each of them, I looked into their eyes and saw a little bit of the 7-year-old Peter, trembling with fear in the tool shed, or the 16-year-old Cecilia, creating desperate strategies to protect her brother. Today, at 88, when I look back, I see how those terrible 2 weeks in 1953 defined my entire life. The protection system I created out of necessity transformed into a methodology that I trained dozens of educators to implement. Strategies to recognize signs of abuse, to intervene without causing more damage, to rebuild a broken child's trust. All of this was born from that painful experience. And as for Gertrude, it took me decades to make peace with her memory, not to justify her actions, but to understand that hurt people often hurt others. The girl who once suffered at the hands of her stepmother now understands that true healing only comes when we transform our scars into purpose. Peter is a grandfather today. His teenage grandchildren, when we gather on special dates, sometimes talk about those days, no longer with acute pain, but with the understanding that only the passage of time can bring. "You saved my life twice," he always says. "Once on the night of the fever, and every day when you protected me from her." My dears, if this story has found your heart today, I want you to know that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. The scars we carry may define us, but they don't have to limit us. They can, in fact, become our deepest purpose. I sincerely thank you for accompanying me on this journey of memories. I know it's not easy to hear stories of pain, but I hope you've also found the hope and redemption that I eventually found. And if you who are watching now carry your own invisible scars, know that you are not alone. Healing comes in sharing, strength in transforming pain into purpose. My dear friends, thank you for watching this episode of Grandparents' Tales. If these stories touch your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more wisdom from those who've walked before us. Your likes and shares help these important stories reach those who might need them most. Remember that even our darkest moments can become the light that guides others.